think before I answer the question, I actually want to tell you a little bit about what's happening in the United States. And actually my answer to the question is going to be more of an invitation or a provocation potentially, because we're in a really different, we're trying to figure this out. So one of the things in figuring it out is we don't want to be definitive about how, we want to explore what might be possible. So in the United States, within the philanthropic sector, there's a growing number of foundations that are thinking about what it might look like to situate equity within evaluative practice. And they're thinking about three things. They're thinking about how does evaluation in its practice both serve equity and also reflect equity, so the means and the ends. It is also thinking about the ways in which we might evolve our definition of validity so that it reflects the multiplicity of experiences and perspectives that exist in the world, and that it also thinks about participant ownership. Evaluation is often very extractionary, science is very extractionary, and how do we share the knowledge we take from other people with them in ways so they actually get to own it. And lastly, how might evaluation, instead of starting at the point of the intervention or the evaluation, how might it actually also look at the systemic and historical drivers? How might it actually understand the ways in which the foundation or the consultant or the nonprofit or charity somehow in its own operations might be part of the problem, right? How do we actually, and then how does it look at context? So we're trying to figure, and we refer to that as the equitable evaluation principles. So the three of them. And so there's a growing group of foundations that are trying to figure out what it's like to situate those in their evaluation work. I think it's important to note that what's common among those foundations, and there's also consultants and some social enterprises, is that all of them have done what we refer to in the United States as their work. Meaning they have begun to understand the ways in which white dominant framing, capitalism, and patriarchy have actually framed everything in the United States. They have limited and are limiting our ability to thrive, and evaluation, because it's an instrument of that, is also limited. And so they've done that work. And so for them, reimagining how we create knowledge, which is one of the things evaluation does, is just another thing that they're reimagining. So they're not starting there. They're like, oh, you're right. All those things are part of how we live in the US. We have to look at evaluation through a new lens as well. I like to say they've gone through the looking glass, right? They've had an aha moment. Sometimes it's an oh no moment. Oftentimes they've gone into this work because they were really excited and thought they were doing good, and then they realized they were being complicit with an overwhelming system of control and domination. They feel really bad, they get over it, and then they're like, okay, I can't unsee it. Now I have to imagine what it would be different. So that's what's kind of common across all of those organizations, individuals. The effort is called the Equitable Evaluation Initiative. It started in 2019. It'll end in 2023. We did that on purpose because we're trying to find people who won't go back. And we're hoping to have 40 to 50 foundations at the end of that. And then we'll figure out if there's a way in which we can support them. An important thing to think about, and it's part of what happens in evaluation, is that we think the first thing you have to do is be different in the work. So it's not about doing a different method, although we think there will be methodological shifts. It's how we, because we're humans, right? How are we as humans understanding our racialized, genderized self in the world? How is that affecting the ways in which we are seeing, believing, understanding other people? How is that affecting what we define as evidence, as knowledge, what we see as story versus data? Like, why do we consider them as two different things? They're all knowledge, but some are more valid than others, right? So part of the first thing is for people to situate themselves in what they're holding as their maybe implicit bias, maybe not intentional bias, and saying, oh, okay. And then trying to actively, aggressively, consistently check themselves as they are in their work. And we think by being different in the work, you start to think differently. And then if you start to think differently, you can start to do differently, right? So we call this group of individuals that have joined us, they're all foundations, are Equipping for Transformation partners. And we call them Equipping for Transformation because part of the first thing they have to do is figure out how to be different in themselves and then be different in relationship to other people in their work. And then how do they start to have different conversations? So again, being different, then thinking different, and then doing different. And what we've learned, or what we've heard from our practice partners, is that they're also looking for consultants who will help them be different in their work as well. Which is interesting because consultants, and I'm sure it's also the same in Brazil, is that consultants are hired for their expertise. And what we're trying to do is step away from being experts and recognizing that there's lots of different expertise. And so it requires a kind of humility, which isn't necessarily baked into philanthropy or being an evaluator, right? We all think we know what we're doing. We get hired for our methodological expertise. And so what we're saying is that's less important because we're trying to come up with new methods potentially. And so for a lot of evaluators, that's kind of a existential crisis for them because they don't know who they are if they're not an expert. And so sort of our next wave of work is to figure out who among consultants is willing to be as vulnerable and humble and to accept their humanity in the work so they can work with the foundations to collectively create new ways of doing the work. So it's not just foundations, it's also evaluators, right? So that's what's happening in the US. Again, early stages. It's a super Western frame. We know even the word equity means something different in certain places. When I got the opportunity to explore what it might look like in Brazil, I obviously went to Freire because how could you not? And what I started to look at was, one, mindful of the Western frame, what I'm curious about, and this is the provocation, the invitation, what are the ways in which the pedagogical principles, right, align with the equitable evaluation principles, and what might it look like for you all to have the same commitment to those principles in your evaluation work, not just in education. And I'll say not just as if education is less, but that's where it's primarily centered. How do we not think about evaluation as also holding some of those principles equally important? And so I'm going to do some paraphrasing of some of the principles and where I see where there's some potential alignment. So the first one about praxis, right? Action and reflection. I'm paraphrase it. I'm going to read it to make sure I don't get it wrong. It's not enough for people to come together and dialogue in order to gain knowledge of their social reality. They must act together upon their environment in order to critically reflect upon that reality, and so transform it through further action and critical reflection. Right? So when I read this and I think about the equitable evaluation principle 1, which is about evaluation is for equity, its means and ends, that's an axiological shift is what we refer to it. So instead of evaluation just being about determining merit or worth, it's merit and worth in relationship to equity. Right, so what would it look like for evaluators, third sector actors, and others to think of evaluation as praxis in service of equity? So that's the question for you all there. The next principle, again, paraphrasing, gonna read it so I don't get it wrong. The Easter principle. Those who authentically commit themselves to the people must re-examine themselves constantly. This conversion is so radical as to not allow for ambivalent behavior. Conversion to the people requires a profound rebirth. Those who undergo it must take on a new form of existence. They can no longer remain as they were. So for me, as I go back to that earlier comments around being different, how are you as practitioner of evaluation be transformed in the work? Right? That you become part of the strategy, the solution. You're not just this person that sits on the outside that's holding judgment. You actually are part of the transformation that's happening, right? So that's the other thing that I think about. And then lastly, the last one is dialogue, right? To enter into dialogue presupposes equality among participants. Each must trust the other. There must be mutual respect and love, care and commitment. Each one must question what he, she, or they know and realize that through dialogue, existing thoughts will change and new knowledge will be created. So for me, this is all about relationships. Relationships, 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 right? And that takes time. It takes care and feeding. You can't just decide suddenly, I care what you think and you're going to tell me, right? How do we build that trust over time, that intimacy? How do I know that you will hear and understand what I say? And if not, we'll ask the right amount of questions, right? So it can't be rushed. And as I thought about this, I thought about where might there be those types of trusting relationships that already exist within your ecosystem, where bringing the EEI principles and the pedagogical principles to bear might make sense. Like they always say, I'm not gonna remember the metaphor now, but there's the elephant in the room, or do you try to take down the elephant in the room, or do you try to go someplace where it's a little bit easier? I don't think that's the right metaphor, but you want to go where something's ripe, where there's an opportunity, where there's trust for people to be able to try something different. You don't want to go to the most difficult, fraught, emotional place and say, let's try something new, because there's no trust there. Right. So where might there be places and people where this kind of thinking might actually lend itself? So that's what I started thinking about when you asked me the question, was really how might we bring conscientiation, right? Did I say it right? To evaluation practice in Brazil. So I didn't necessarily have an answer to the question. I'm actually at this stage more interested in asking more and different questions to more people and see what they bring based on their cultural context, based on what they believe to be true. I do really think, though, we are at a pivotal point in our evolution as humans where we have an opportunity to really rethink much of what we believe to be true. And I think in order for us to do that in any sustained way, it has to be across borders, it has to be across lands, and I think it has to be across languages.